Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, and welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm Maryam Hilli, your host, and I'm joined by my co-host and mental health professional, Sister Anisa Diab. Welcome to the show, Sister Anisa.
Thank you so much.
And today's episode, we're actually talking about Muslim responses to domestic violence, and we're joined by an extremely special guest who is a licensed clinical psychologist in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and the state of Palestine for over 25 years, with a speciality in trauma, interpersonal violence, and indigenous populations. She began her career working with Central American refugees on the Arizona border as a coordinator of Casa Campanara with a liberation theology perspective as part of the sanctuary movement. She's written over 17 published professional articles, 3 book chapters, and presented on over 100 occasions internationally related to her topics of speciality. She's also a forensic psychologist who has evaluated over 1,000 individuals and served as an expert witness in cases involving criminal, family, immigration, and human rights law. She's also worked in the United States, West Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. She previously served as a director of children and adolescent services for community behavioral health in Philadelphia. She's the executive director of the Liberty Center for Survivors of Torture, the vice president of the Latin American Community Center in Wilmington, as the clinical director of En-Najah Child Institute, and as a professor in the medical faculty at the En-Najah National University of Palestine. She's also fluent in Spanish, English, and has moderate fluency in both French and Arabic. Now that is quite a bio. And our special guest is Dr. Denise Ziya Berte. Welcome to the show, sister.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for having me to discuss this very important topic within our community.
Alaikum salam. We're honored to have you on our show today. You have an impressive bio, but as an executive director of Peaceful Families Project, can you tell us about your work and how the organization serves the Muslim community?
Absolutely. Peaceful Families Project is really an organization that has as its goal looking at positive family functioning and the elimination of domestic violence within Muslim communities through an Islamic perspective. So there's a lot of confusion about how Islam manages or talks about domestic violence. And what we do is to really go back to the sacred text, to the Hadith, to the Quran, and talk about domestic violence as a form of oppression, as a human rights issue from a Muslim perspective. In that work, we do community trainings, we make resources, we do research with the idea of having the Muslim experience, the Muslim voice, and the Muslim solution as part of our work. And we look at not only domestic violence, but all kinds of family violence. So we have a program called Peaceful Parenting, which has to do with positive parenting techniques. We have Peaceful Partners, which is engaging male allies in the struggle against domestic violence. We work with Peaceful Futures. We know that domestic violence, unfortunately, does not start, at 25 or 26 when someone gets married. It is about messages and beliefs that start from a very young age. So we work with youth as well. We have something called Peaceful Partings. We know that in Islam, marriage is supposed to be to create peace. And if it isn't, then we have this wonderful option of peacefully parting and co-parenting and going on with our lives. That is not, I know when we talk to folks, there's some confusion culturally about that not being a part of Islam, but divorce certainly is. Peaceful divorce is certainly a part of Islam. And then we have a program called Peaceful World, where we use our curriculums and our resources and our trainings internationally.
And this is the first time we've actually had a mental health professional on the show that's worked in the forensic psychology field. Can you tell us, the viewers, and for my benefit as well, a little bit more about your field of work in forensic psychology?
Sure. So forensic psychology just talks about how psychologists and psychological professionals can give information that informs legal systems and legal decisions. And that can be at a very basic level in a case like domestic violence, where there may not be proof that someone has been a victim of domestic violence, or other than their sort of psychological trauma, or in cases of child custody, in terms of making good decisions for children about where they should live and how the separation of parenting tasks should happen. So we do work within individual cases. And then, of course, with my work with political violence, we also are able to document the impact of certain policies and actions on an entire population of people. That gets used in the ICC, the International Criminal Court. It also helps in terms of documenting historically the experiences of people who have suffered from trauma, whether that be, or violence, whether that be individual, family, or community-based.
Sister Anisa, if I can bring you into the discussion, what does domestic violence entail? What are some of the nuances in the way that it can look within Muslim communities?
For sure. And I just want to give a trigger warning before we start talking about these issues that some of the things we're going to be discussing today are going to be sensitive. And so they're definitely not going to be appropriate for younger children to listen in on. And maybe even for somebody who they themselves have been through domestic violence or are dealing with it right now. If you find that you're overwhelmed by what we're talking about today, please take a break, reach out to a mental health professional, and definitely, come back to this in your own time. So having said that, domestic violence, it's a pattern of behavior where one person is trying to dominate or control another individual. And this could be through verbal threats, manipulation, insults, physical violence. It could be through stonewalling behaviors where you completely ignore the other person's existence and needs. It can be physical in nature, it can be sexual in nature, and whether it's in Muslim communities or in non-Muslim communities, there's a pretty predictable pattern of behavior that we see taking place in the cycle of abuse. And for today, we're going to be focusing more on intimate partner violence, but we're also going to touch on child abuse a bit as well, because oftentimes when there is intimate partner violence in the home, there is also an effect with abuse on children. So in this cycle of abuse, it begins with a honeymoon phase, a honeymoon period, where the perpetrator of the domestic violence perhaps apologizes for their mistakes, their abuse. They might blame themselves, make false promises to do better, to change. They try to make repair attempts by giving gifts, and this might last for a period of time, maybe give or take a few weeks, and then you move into the tension building part of the cycle. And this is where the criticism starts to seep in. What kind of wife are you for cooking food like that for me? Yelling, the swearing, anger being directed at the spouse. And then the partner begins to feel as though they're walking on eggshells with this person. And they begin to feel anxious because they know that this is leading to the next phase of the cycle, which is an explosion. This is the explosion phase of the cycle. And this is where the attacks are being made, the threats are happening. Things like if you keep acting like this, and we get divorced, I promise you'll never see your kids again. If you contact the authorities on me, I'm going to make sure that your entire family suffers. At this point, there may be a lot of control tactics. In the Muslim community, we see a lot of spiritual guilt taking place. You can't deny me sex, for example, because this is my Islamic right. You're sinning right now by denying me my right. If you don't give me what I want, I'm going to find another wife. And then guess what happens? The spouse gives in and goes into this mode of silencing his or herself, beginning to disappear just to try to keep the peace. And this peacekeeping, trying to keep the peace, it's not a healthy form of coping. It doesn't mean the relationship is improving. It's really a trauma response. And maybe he or she even threatens to leave, go to the parents' house, promises, to work on themselves. Eventually, the victim of domestic violence ends up going back a lot of the times because the offender might make, again, these false promises. They're going to work on themselves. They're going to get counseling. They're going to do better. And therein is the hook again. So the partner ends up right back in the cycle of abuse all over again, starting with the honeymoon phase, going into the tension phase, going into the explosion phase. And that's why it's so difficult to get out of this cycle. And, inshallah, we can look at more of the nuances and hear Dr. Denise's experience as well about what she's seeing in the Muslim community and how we can assist those who might be stuck in this cycle.
Is emotional abuse considered domestic violence?
Absolutely. I mean, abuse can also be emotional in nature. Violence isn't just physical. An example of emotional abuse would be constantly threatening to leave you, hurt you, or end their life by suicide if you leave them for their abuses, calling names, hurting feelings on a regular basis, fault finding, using financial control, or preventing the spouse from accessing money. And what's interesting is the research actually shows emotional abuse is potentially more detrimental than physical abuse, because with physical abuse, the wounds heal, right? There is an injury and then there's a healing process that takes place. But when it comes to mental health wounds, those are more difficult to heal over time. So it's been found that those who stay in relationships that are domestically violent, they're at increased risk. The victims are increased risk for depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other issues related to self-esteem. So it's very difficult, for a person to leave this situation, because I think from an emotional perspective, when the victim hears over and over something negative about themselves or not being good enough, they begin to believe those messages, they begin to internalize it. And that's why domestic violence is really about power and control. The perpetrator is lacking total empathy, lacking emotional intelligence. They're narcissistic, oftentimes power hungry. They don't have time for your feelings. They don't have time for your emotions. And if you open up and you're vulnerable about it, oftentimes they'll insult you by saying you're just too sensitive or you're just too emotional. And there's a brainwashing that takes place with the victim. And that's why it takes on average, about 7 attempts for, a woman to finally leave the relationship for good if it's the female who's experiencing it. So in our response as a Muslim community, we need to be cognizant of how challenging it can be to leave those situations, and respectful, and not place the blame on the victim in the situation, but the perpetrator who is committing the abuses.
We often find that many Muslims are afraid to speak out when they witness or hear of abuse among their extended family or friends, because one, the potential of breaking up families by getting child protective services involved, and then the potential of those children going into the foster care system, and two, due to the fear of retaliation that these individuals might face if they report these behaviours. Having said this, Sister Denise, if we know that children are experiencing abuse at the hands of parents, extended family members or friends, what is our responsibility as religious leaders or community members to address this?
I think there's 2 levels to this question. So first of all, we know that our immediate response to an actual victim and an actual family in need is essential, is critical in terms of saving or minimizing the harm to that particular individual. And yes, unfortunately, there may be family ramifications, but responsible leaders, whether they're educators, whether they're religious leaders, have an obligation, unfortunately, to report child abuse, and a lot of times being exposed to domestic violence, horrific acts of violence to someone that you care about, your mother or your father, in front of you, is in fact considered a secondary crime of domestic violence or of child abuse because of the effects that has on children. So immediately, of course, we need to make sure that there is safety. We need to get involved mental health systems, legal systems, advocacy systems, social work systems, for every person in the family, for both the victims and the children, but also perpetrators. You know, one of the beautiful things that we have in Islam is when we're asked about what we do for oppressors, right? The first thing that we're told is to allow them to know that they are oppressing, right? That's our first responsibility as believers. So making clear to that person what they're doing, and inshallah, that we do that even before that legal systems are involved. So that's like in an immediate kinds of sense. The other piece really, though, is this idea of social norms and social acceptability. And part of our responsibility, as with every kind of oppression that we see, as with every kind of human rights violation, it is our job as believers to address that within our community. Peaceful Families, 10 years ago, we are doing the retake of this research, but in 2011, did the first set of research looking at what is the Muslim American experience of domestic violence. And within that research, we found that over 52% of just general Muslims had been either the direct or had somebody directly involved with them that was a victim of domestic violence. And 67% were aware of someone within the Muslim community who was a victim of domestic violence. That's almost 70% of our community. What our job is then, of course, is to make clear all the time and over again what our response to domestic violence should be, to make very clear that this is not our deen. The domestic violence is not part of our deen. It is not part of our tradition. It is not okay. It is not acceptable within our faith tradition. It has to do with sort of really eliminating this tolerance, things from, you know, small jokes about, oh, well, that's how women are, or that's how wives are, to, you know, the kind of, well, he's the husband. What can we say? What can we do? And we don't always talk about men, unfortunately, because again, we're talking about systemic kinds of issues. The incidence of domestic violence is at this point about 95% female victims, about 5% male victims. And those male victims, again, are usually vulnerable in some other way, either by mental illness, by intellect, by immigration status, or something else, because domestic violence is a system of oppression that uses power and control. And in most cases, in all of the countries that we work in, women have generally less power and control than the men within the community. So when we talk about what our responses should be, there needs to be responses at every level of the community. So religious leaders, our imams, need to be talking about domestic violence as a form of oppression within their Friday khutbahs, within their community education, when they do premarital counseling, which should always be a part. We are Muslim, we believe in marrying for life, which means we need to have the adequate tools and ability to select positive partners. That needs to be something that's discussed even before the marriage, but also with male allies. So one of the programs that we have is really working with male allies, we have something called the Peaceful Partner Pledge, which is Muslim men signing off to say that I am very aware that my leadership role within the family does not include violence, does not include oppression, does not include humiliation. So we need other men to be telling that to men. We, again, working with victims, putting Band-Aids on people who are already damaged or hurt is only one part of what we do. A good part of what we do is really changing what our expectations are, what our reactions are, even when we hear these small incidents, these small, a brother saying to his wife, your food is never good. Look, this other sister brought this wonderful thing. Oh, my wife can't possibly do that. She's not. All those small sort of microaggressions, which really we know are part of a bigger system of humiliating or taking power from a partner within the relationship.
As you mentioned, a majority of domestic violence victims are female, but men do obviously still experience domestic violence, and it's not something that we discuss very often on this channel or just at all in our communities. For men who do experience domestic violence or who are struggling with it, how can we help them? What can you tell me, both of you? what can we tell any viewer who's watching who might be male and struggling with domestic violence? I'll come to you first, Sister Anisa, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think first we have to acknowledge that, yes, it does occur less frequently than among females, but I personally have experience working with Muslim men who tell me they've been abused by their spouses. And I can remember one particular instance where, this individual is talking about how their wife constantly was threatening to poison them in their food, was throwing clothes out the window. I've had female clients who, when we're talking about arguments with the spouse and, how the past week has been going, just, are just unabashedly saying, yeah, I slapped him for what he said to me, or I punched him in the stomach. And in those moments, I really have to challenge that with my clients and say, do you realize you are the one being abusive here? And, we try to redirect those behaviors. But I think one of the distinguishing factors between what makes it so difficult for men as opposed to women who are battered is that men are much more likely to be embarrassed by the abuse, right? What will people think of me if I let others know a woman beat me up? I don't want to be laughed at. No one would believe me, because as Dr. Denise was saying, there's so many jokes and internet memes that are just, I mean, it's supposed to be funny, but it's really not funny. I've seen about the 100th meme with a woman taking a, sandal and slapping her husband in the head or her son in the head this week. And it's not funny. It really isn't. And it just perpetuates the stigma against men seeking help for domestic violence. Domestic violence. It's not about size. It's not about gender. It's not about strength. It's about power. It's about control. It's getting out of dangerous situations and getting help, whether you are a woman being abused or you're a male being abused. So I think it's really critical, especially for a male who's being abused, to not be afraid to reach out for help and to know the appropriate resources, whether that's contacting the domestic abuse helpline or finding supports that are available, like Peaceful Families, and how they can get the assistance that they need, and counseling and the legal advice to be able to move forward.
And Dr. Denise, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
Sure. I'll talk a little bit also about the very precarious systems that touch the lives of immigrants, depending on where they are. So one of the difficulties that we have, and where we see a lot of times males be in a more fragile situation, is when there are immigration issues in the family, as well as domestic violence, or the domestic violence touches on the fact that one partner may have legal status, the other one may need that partner to apply for them, or to follow through the process, or to stay married for 2 years, or whatever that may be. And that is systems where we see males maybe at a disadvantage if it is the wife that is the person who has status. So one is to know that we look at all of those pieces as part of domestic violence. So there is oppression of abuse of money, abuse of power, abuse of documentation status, all of those kinds of things. The second piece really is to ensure, and this is really a systemic issue, is to make sure that there are places for male victims to seek out assistance. Unfortunately, because where the domestic violence movement started was sort of white, middle-class Christian women. And the whole system that we have of criminalization of behavior, of the shelter system, of reporting, had to do with their needs, and does not necessarily work for marginalized populations, whether they be Muslim, whether they be immigrant, whether they be non-English speaking, whether they be male. So we need to make sure that attached to our masjids, attached to our communities, are services for people who may not be English speakers, who may be male, who may be immigrants, who may be different in other kinds of ways, to make sure that they do have the same open doors, that they have the same linguistic access, that they have the same legal rights and the same legal services that we give to other people in our population around the issues of domestic violence.
Thank you. Sister Anisa, when there's a dispute between spouses, families often are asked to meet to intervene or mend the relationship, or just mediate. However, what should someone do when this isn't helpful, and when it can even be harmful to someone who may be in a domestic violence situation?
Good question. So it's interesting, the Quran, what it says, right? In chapter 4, verse 35, Surah An-Nisa, talks about that if there's a breach between two individuals, that an arbitrator should be appointed from both families, one from his side of the family, one from her side of the family. And if they wish for peace, Allah will cause reconciliation, and Allah has full knowledge, is acquainted with all things. And I think what's key here is that this mediator should be somebody who is trustworthy, someone who's honest, someone who's actually going to be helpful. And I think, of course, first, when you're starting with mediation, you want to focus on yourselves and try to see, first and foremost, if both individuals can mediate on their own, if not, to seek outside help. And I think that bringing families together can be helpful in some situations. Like, I've had clients who, one I remember in particular, she was dealing with some abuse, and letting her family know what was going on was very important, because they were making more regular checks on her, and they were doing random visits. And this seemed to help keep the other person's, behavior in check. So sometimes that, it's critical to be able to share with family what's happening and what's going on. But I've also found other situations where, somebody will be trying to escape what the abuse and what's going on, and will go to their parents' home, and the parents will say, "What are you doing here? You need to go back. Even if he has a gun, even if he pulled out a knife, like, you need to be back there and make this work for your kids." And of course, what do you think is going to happen to this person? The abuse is going to get worse, right? So I think that everybody needs to look at their situation and who is actually going to be helpful and who isn't, whether it's family or an outside resource. And it's really critical to be able to identify all the different connections that a person can access. So, for example, looking at the Muslim shelters that are available, Sakina Homes is a great one. They have, locations within the US, within Canada, and London as well. Looking at contacting a domestic violence hotline and seeing what their tips are, contacting a domestic violence advocate. There's a lot that has to be considered if somebody is going to try to leave this situation, whether it's getting a separate bank account, packing an emergency bag, making sure all the important documents are ready to go if there is an emergency and you need to leave in that moment, making sure that everything is in order if you can't return back to your residence. So there's a lot of planning involved, and a lot of times I think people just jump to their parents' house or something like that and think they're going to find help or a trusted friend, and they find it's not helpful. So most important is to get professional support. Reach out to a licensed mental health professional that's going to walk you through the steps to get out of this situation safely, and contact only people that you absolutely trust are going to be helpful in this situation, and not hesitate to call 911 if you're in immediate danger, or emergency dispatch.
And Dr. Denise, you've worked with families from all over the world experiencing interpersonal abuse, trauma, and violence. What's something that you've learned from your experiences that you wish others would recognize or implement in terms of how we should, as a Muslim community, respond?
Okay. So first of all, I do want to talk about this idea of mediation and joint therapy and things like this. And what I want to remind us is that domestic violence is not an anger issue. Most of the time, perpetrators of domestic violence are lovely human beings who are not violent with their boss. They don't kick the dog. It really is this belief that within the family, they are the head of the household, and that head of the household status gives them the ability to be physically, emotionally controlling to both wives and sometimes children as well. So the idea is that we don't confuse this with normal conflict, normal marital conflicts, normal kinds of conversation, normal kinds of mediation. So first of all, we need to ensure the safety of the people involved, right? So it's not necessarily mediation or even joint therapy is not suggested at all for situations of domestic violence. What is suggested is for each person to get some kind of relief and recuperation while maybe living apart until they can live safely together when violence has been repeated. Okay, so the idea is that we don't put them together in a room and have, you know, the victim, whoever that may be, sort of give this list of horrible things that have happened to them, because unfortunately what happens is that lights a match under the fire of the perpetrator, who then feels even more humiliated and is likely to be more violent versus less violent. The other thing, because we're also very quick to tell women, well, you should just leave. If this has happened, you should just leave. We know statistically, and this is unfortunately globally, that women or victims are at more risk when they are leaving than when they are staying. More risk of actual death, homicide, those kinds of things. So it is not simply, there isn't a one quick answer. The idea is that, as our sister was saying, it takes a fair amount of understanding of the very complex situation of that particular family. We also have to listen to victims, because victims know better than anyone their perpetrator, their level of danger. They will be able to tell you, this person would do this person wouldn't do that. They're not always on target completely, but they do have a better idea than we do. When we say, oh, well, he wouldn't possibly, or he's never had a gun, so your life is not in danger. What we have to remember is domestic violence is an actual life danger. It isn't just the danger of divorce or the danger of separation of a family. That there is, unfortunately, and we have had these within our own communities, situations where, because this idea of honor becomes an issue, both within a family of origin, a father and uncle, a brother, or a husband saying, you know, you have disrespected us to the point that your life is no longer material. It doesn't matter. What matters is the status of our family or the respect. And sometimes, again, it gets into a piece of spiritual abuse where it is, you are disrespecting Islam, or my interpretation of Islam, or my perspective of what Islam is. And those are the kinds of situations that are most dangerous. And I think a lot of times, again, we make this conversation about the worst thing that can happen is to have a divorce, or the worst thing that can happen. And there are much worse things. And unfortunately, and when we have those incidents within our communities, it hurts the community, absolutely, but it also hurts it hurts Islam, because it makes it look like this is a piece of Islam. And this is a big part of our work at Peaceful Families, is to talk not only to our own communities, but to outside communities, to say, this is not Islam. This is not what our text says. This is not how our prophet, peace be upon him, treated his wife or his wives or his community. This is not part of who we are as a religion. And that becomes very important as well. So a lot of what we do is called myth busting, is this idea of, what does gender mean? In Islam, we are made from one soul. We're not even made from a rib. We are made from one soul. We are absolutely equal. We have absolute equal rights. We have, oppression is a sin against all of humanity. And those are the kinds of messages that we really need out in the community for ourselves, but also to the larger global community.
And Dr. Denise, talking about a larger global community, our audience is global. So the viewers of this particular show will be from different parts of the world. So what advice would you give to the person who's watching right now, who's experiencing domestic violence? And bear in mind, geographically they could be in different parts of the world.
Absolutely. I think for that particular individual, the statement always is, Allah created marriage to make sakina. That's it. Not to have children, not to make households, not to make money, not to make, your mom or your mother-in-law happy. The goal of marriage within Islam is sakina, is to make peace only. Because we know that as believers, to be productive and faithful believers, we need peace. We need to live in peaceful relationships, in peaceful homes, in peaceful spaces. So everyone has the right and the obligation as a believer to ensure that their relationships are peaceful. And if they are not, to seek a peaceful parting, to seek a peaceful end, whether that's through therapy, whether that's through divorce, in whatever way that is. So I think the most important thing is to know that that you have the right and the obligation as a believer to create families based in peace, dignity of all members of the family. So I think that's really important. I also think that as communities, we also need to remind ourselves that this is Islamic. I live and work in Palestine when I'm not in the United States. And one of the things that we had was a law that came up recently of family protection law. And it was turned down by our own community because they saw it as a Western issue. Like, this is something that's coming to us from the West. This is, if we open the Quran, it's there. It is not imported. It is not something outside of Islam. Protecting vulnerable people, including women and children, is absolutely part of our deen. Making sure that family relationships are just is absolutely part of our deen. Making sure that families create peaceful places for us to build, little Muslims, for us to build a community is absolutely part of our deen. So I think no matter where we are in the globe, no matter what our legal system says, we know that this is part of Islam, and this is an Islamic obligation. This is not apart from, this is not something that's being done to us. It's being done, against us by, whatever kinds of government we live under. That this in ourselves is part of our deen. It's part of our Quran. It's part of our commandments from Allah.
And Anisa, if I come to you, there'll be somebody who's watching the show right now who might be in a difficult situation, might be suffering from domestic violence, but they might also feel that they will end up breaking their relationship, if they speak about it, and they're quite worried that it might, be detrimental to them, because it can negatively impact their children perhaps, or their family structure. What would you say to somebody who's watching right now who might be in that situation?
Yeah, so staying in an abusive situation and even a lethal situation, as Dr. Denise was saying, right? Some of these levels of abuse vary for every family. It's detrimental. It's unacceptable. It's detrimental. It goes against Islam to stay in a situation of oppression. Allah wants us to stand up for ourselves, to stand up for our rights. Our right is to have a marriage and a family life that's full of sakina, full of surur and tranquility. And in my professional experience, I often will hear this where, well, I can't leave because what will happen to the children, or how is this going to affect them? And trust me when I say this, if there's ongoing tension in the home, your children are going to experience that same tension themselves. They are watching this show. They are going to feel unsafe. And safety, this should be the utmost priority in the home. And what I often see is that when a tension occurs between partners, it's often directed towards the children in some way. It gets projected onto them. You are modeling for your children what a healthy marriage looks like. And if your children are watching this show every day of screaming and attacks and all of that, what effect do you think they're going to have in terms of their mental health and their psychological development? It's going to affect them, not just into their childhood and adolescent life, but into their adult and married life as well. A successful marriage, it's not about staying married. It's about having a healthy marriage, a marriage where you're setting a good example for your kids. Nobody gets married anticipating divorce, but when reconciliation and peace can't be attained at home, Islam offers this solution in the form of divorce. And families, they come in all different sizes, all different shapes, and family, just because you might be living in a family with a divorced parent and two children doesn't make you any less of a family than other families. Family is where a person feels safe, they feel loved. That is what makes a home a home. And unfortunately, there's just a great deal of stigma in our community with divorcees, not just divorcees themselves, but the children of the divorcees. And I know this firsthand as somebody whose parents divorced when I was 5 years old, that the community judges you, they treat you differently, they question your ability to be a good wife, a good mother, a respectable person, just based off of this family dynamic, which I find very sad. And I've actually, in my clinical experience, I've found that children of divorce are one of the most psychologically progressive groups of individuals, because they don't want the same thing that happened to their families to happen to them as well. So my hope for the community and our response is that we begin to readjust our mindset about divorced families or those who may be dealing with the aftermath of leaving an abusive relationship.
Thank you for that. It's actually quite refreshing to hear some of the things that you just said. Many individuals, though, do still find it difficult to leave an abusive situation due to finances, perhaps, or it might just be mentally difficult for them. I'm wondering if perhaps they're probably also wondering, should I give my partner another chance? Can abusive partners change, and should they be allowed the opportunity to do so? If I can come to you first, Dr. Denise.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we are working on, even as we speak, is a Muslim curriculum for batterers programs. So we do know that within a lot of legal systems, even when the partner has been charged with a crime related to domestic violence, they are sent into treatment, right? The idea is that, of course, we believe that everyone can change. We believe, and this is something I actually have done in my professional life, is to run batterers programs. And they're, again, a large percent of people who fall into this cycle, it is because they saw domestic violence within their home as children as well. So one of the things that is happening here in the United States and globally as well is that we don't really have intervention programs, batterers programs that are based in Islamic teachings. So when people have to go to these kinds of programs, they're going to programs that were not created for them. And unfortunately, that makes it really easy for them to say, oh, this is an American program, or this is a British program, or these are not Muslims. So one of the things that we are actually working on under our Peaceful Partners program is pulling together experts from across the globe, from across the country, from different communities to really create a curriculum for domestic violence batterers that show them directly how this is part of Islam. And the other thing is that we're given amazing models for peacefully living together. Islam is one of the faith traditions that has written the most about, like, very detailed. So when you have to make a decision, this is the way you do it. This is joint consultation. How do we get together? How do we, all of these kinds of things. And it's very helpful in terms of structuring and explaining and giving people a chance to really live in a different way. Now, when I say that again is not individual couples work. Because most of the time family perpetrators are not able to manage that kind of work until they've been through their own treatment. It also doesn't mean that the family shouldn't separate for some period of time in terms of safety, because we want to make sure that these patterns of behavior do not cause a victim to say, okay, well, I'll just take him back, because that, unfortunately, as you heard initially, this is part of the cycle, right? That things get better, I promise. So one of the things that we're looking at is, how do we provide safe spaces for men who are going through batterers program? Where do we send them? How do they, peacefully sort of take a break from the family until they can really manage their own feelings? Because it's also not good for perpetrators. It is criminalized in many Western countries. You can be jailed. You can be deported back to your country of origin if you are not originally from that country. And the other thing is, who wants to be in a position where they, in a rage, create some really physical damage to their closest loved ones? Nobody really wants that. That is not good for anybody. So working with perpetrators is part of our obligation. Again, as Muslims, these are still believers. These are still part of our community. And even if they leave this person, they're going to get married to somebody else in our community. So the idea is that we have to offer not judgment. We judge behaviors, we judge actions, we don't judge people, but that we offer rehabilitation programs.
Thank you. And Sister Anisa, would you like to add anything to that?
I think she said it beautifully, and especially this idea that, you know, if this person doesn't get help, if the perpetrator doesn't unlearn this violence, the cycle is going to repeat with somebody else. And it reminds me of what the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and his family said, that, you know, we should help both the oppressed and the oppressor. And when the companion asked, you know, how do we know how to help the person who's oppressed, but how do we help the oppressor? You know, his response was by stopping him from doing the oppressing. So if we can address it at that level, that's when we begin to make systemic changes. So it's phenomenal to hear that this is in the works at Peaceful Families, and I look forward to following that.
Definitely. And I'd like to say that, you know, I've learned so much from both of you in this episode. It's actually been very insightful, very different to what we normally hear. But just before we end the show, Dr. Denise, where can viewers go to get further information about Peaceful Families, and are there any resources that you would like to recommend to our viewers?
Absolutely. So our website, it's interesting because Peaceful Families is across the United States with this international impact. So we are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So the beautiful thing about that is almost everything that we do is taped or is virtual. So if you go onto our website, which is www.peacefulfamilies.org, you will find really a wealth of resources. We have domestic violence tea talks, which are domestic violence 101 in Urdu, in Arabic, in English. We will soon have in Indonesian and in Yoruba, because we work with a very diverse population, and in Spanish. So those are on the website. Those are something somebody can just, again, they don't have to go to somewhere if they can just watch and explore. We have resources on there for religious leaders, for imams, on how to address domestic violence within the masjid, within the khutbahs on a weekly basis. We have also a domestic violence, a survivor's handbook, which not only explains domestic violence, but talks about how to create safety plans, how to look for services. We also have on our website the National, for the United States anyway, the National Domestic Violence Directory for Muslims, where you can go in and look up your locality and become attached to a service provider who is either Muslim or Muslim friendly. We also now sponsor what is called the Manavdi, which is the Muslim Advocates Network Against Domestic Violence. There are 40 organizations that are both global and in the United States that are Muslim advocates against domestic violence. If we have individuals who are working in this area, they are somewhere where you can register and become a part of trainings. And then on our website are also our ongoing trainings. We do an annual imam training for religious leaders. We also have what's called Marriage Matters, which is looking at strengthening marriages. We are now looking at a pilot for our youth program called Peace for Futures. We're looking for 10 organizations really across the globe, but probably between Canada and the United States, where we're training youth leaders to be able to go do. We have a curriculum for middle school, high school, and for MSAs or college age students, so they can begin to, again, make those important explorations, discoveries about healthy relationships even before they're ready to get into a marital situation. So all of that is on our website. Most of our programs these days are virtual, which means we are not limited to the United States. Really, they're open to, and we have a pretty wide global community. As I said, we have programs, several programs in West Africa. We have programs in Palestine, and we work with training with organizations really around the globe.
Thank you so much, and thank you both, and I'm so grateful for your time and for your effort into this show. This has been a really, really insightful and I'm sure it's been very beneficial to our viewers. But unfortunately, we have reached the end of our show today. Thank you once again, Sister Anisa, and thank you once again, Dr. Denise. Dear viewers, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you again, inshallah, very soon. Take care. Wassalamu alaikum.